Can you kind of just briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm John Cohn. I am an IBM Fellow at the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab. I have been at IBM for 40 years. Actually, I exaggerate. I will have been at IBM 40 years in 3 weeks. So my background is in device physics. For most of my career, I did software for chip design, and then I did Internet of Things, and now I'm at a laboratory for artificial intelligence.
Is it possible for AI to be able to simulate how a human can think in regards to finding fake news?
I'm not programmed to respond to that. I'm just kidding. I think it's a great question, Karen. I believe that AI is still at a pretty early phase, but one of the things that AI can do is it can abstract input like text or voice or even facial features, and it can try to sort of decompose them into some fundamental components. And if you look at the space of those fundamental components, even things like, for example, choice of words or referenced sources or even tone, the tone of the writing, you can actually figure out a couple of things. One thing that's pretty interesting is you can figure out who may have originated a piece of text based on their writing style. Famously, you can tell whether a piece of music now was actually created by a composer, like was it really Schubert or was it a fake? And by figuring out what, say, the artist's use of particular musical style things, you could tell whether it was actually written by that person or not. I mean, similarly for text, you can start to determine, basically, who wrote or who did not write a particular piece of, like, a news article or a letter or something like that. And it's that kind of detection to figure out those components is increasingly sophisticated and becomes much, much harder to fake. So AI has already proven that it can actually help, at least prove or disprove that a particular person that or group that authored something, whether it's really them or not. Increasingly, though, there are more and more AI techniques for actually synthesizing, for artificially synthesizing. You probably have seen things like the fake faces, have you ever seen the website, "This person does not exist"? If you look at that, those are human faces that are generated by something called a generalized adversarial network, a GAN. And what happens is you train a GAN on a bunch of people's faces, and then you ask it to synthesize a new face, someone who never existed, and it looks indistinguishable. As a human, you look at it and it looks like it must be a real person, but it isn't. With that sort of notion of, what's called deep fakes, you can do it for static images like faces. You could do it for movies now. It's just a matter of compute power. You could do it for spoken word. That it becomes increasingly hard to detect those kind of fakes. And actually, our lab has some people who are looking at that. And one of the giveaways right now that AI uses is that these fakes tend to be too perfect, that actually a real person makes more unintentional mistakes and things like that. So right now, it's a race between, can you get the AI to be as sloppy as a human and have as much random stuff? But I think it is possible to train AI to understand the authenticity of a source, to either prove or disprove, and to be able to decide whether it was actually a human author or not.
Kind of on the topic of deepfake, how would AI be able to combat such deepfake image videos and images where it's like, this is not real, this is real?
Well, I think you have a couple of things that you can actually do. AI is getting increasingly good at getting a very convincing likeness, of a person speaking. Right now you can see these examples of everybody from President Obama to Jay Leno, saying things that they never did. And what I think right now the best tell, for lack of a better word, is the unnatural perfection, that perhaps, that someone's facial features are too perfect, or more importantly, information that you don't think about, when you're trying to synthesizing, like the unintentional pauses, the cadence of their speech, that when those things become too regular and too perfect, it's a pretty good indication that it was artificially produced. But the more the catch is, so even though you can detect these deep fakes because of their perfection, the people who create the deep fakes can actually put in some artificial randomization that would create them. And it's kind of a race between the people who are trying to detect them and the people who are trying to create them, because but I do think that the best source of our best shot at being able to detect these things is imperfection, because luckily humans are pretty imperfect whenever they're here talking or writing or singing or anything like that. So I think right now we're winning that battle, but who knows?
In what different ways can machine learning help create programs that maybe could filter news into like biased news and then misinformation?
What's a really interesting question, Karen, is I think that AI is good at like determining if someone said something, if it's actually something that someone said or did not say, something like that. I think that those are good. When you talk about like determining what constitutes fake news, I mean, I'm pretty optimistic, but the one thing that's interesting is that so much of what is true and what is fake can be a matter of opinion. You saw certainly in the last year that people's idea of what constituted the truth really was situational. It's troubling because certain things are ambiguous. Right and wrong are kind of a moral point, and that really depends on your moral structure. Now, to the point of actual factual things, I think that what you can do is that you can look at what is the basis for a point of view. What facts or what again, you have to be careful. Facts are things that are testable, like scientific principles and things like that. Historical occurrences are facts if they're, recorded. I think you can actually tie actual facts back, and you can determine whether somebody is, you could say, the Revolutionary War was in 1770, and it was in 1780, and you can go, no, we know otherwise. So you can test facts, but when it comes to opinions and having people who have, extreme views that don't have testable facts, for example, you can have a conspiracy theory, and if you think about it, it's very hard to disprove, no matter how outlandish the claim. You can't show that something is not true. But let's say you're looking at a story, you could ask, like, what evidence is there that supports this point of view? What evidence is it that supports the story that's here in terms of the facts? And you could ask equally, what evidence or what stories or what sources refute it? And then you can do a couple of things. You can sort of just mathematically say, the evidence looks like it's 97% in favor of this point of view that's being put here, or it's 97% against that point of view. And then you could actually look at the sources where the supporting and the refuting evidence is. But still, a human probably has to be in the loop. I mean, I don't know what your own you or your listeners' religious beliefs are, but take something like that to some people is as good as facts, right? And to somebody else, if it's a different religion, would seem to be a work of fiction. How would you, I think what you can do is you can say, what is the supporting evidence for the tenets of a religion and what are the ones against? And then based on your own perspective, you can decide which you want to ascribe to based on your own belief system. So it's not as easy as people want to make it out, other than actual factual data where there might be supporting evidence or counterfactual information. I think the best you can do is help using a computer to help gather supporting and refuting evidence. And then on the basis of that, measure demographically and correct for fairness. But when you're trying to train on historical data for things like, bank loan, likelihood of paying back a bank loan, or, a chance that someone would repeat a crime if they were let out of prison, the data that's out there supports old societal biases. And if you're going to try to correct for them, the problem is you have to make up what you wish it were because there's no historical record. So these biases are really a complicated issue, you know. So again, I think unintentional bias is probably more of a concern to me than intentional bias.
So there are a lot of different AIs nowadays that are out on the internet to help combat misinformation, but is it possible for such AI to be effective on a much larger scale?
I think that's a very good question. I think it's a matter of two things. One is resource, and by resource I mean time, money, compute, because the internet is expanding so fast that if you're trying to keep up with all the different sources of news in every particular language, especially from every outlet, you know, with especially some with have a specific point of view, it just takes a lot of time, money, and skills to do that. And I think that leads so that's a barrier, but the biggest barrier is will. And, you know, it's like any major world issue. And I believe that this kind of misinformation is a huge world issue. You know, if you look at just the breakdown of civil society, really, in this country over the last year, nothing could be more important than, to me, you know, how can you go after any other issue, racial justice, climate, or anything, if you can't agree on what's actually happening? And so there's misinformation. That's why I'm so glad that you're actually on this topic. But the second thing, so the first thing would be resources, you know, time, money, and skills. But the bigger one is will. That is that we all have to agree that it's worth whatever it costs. Kind of the same argument that you would make on climate. You know, you need to get enough political will together to overcome those other obstacles, the concrete obstacles of, you know, how much compute it's going to take, how much storage it's going to take, you know, who's going to pay for it, all of that. You have to agree that not solving this is more expensive than solving it. And unfortunately, when we have a very polarized society, the problem is that when everyone else believes that they're being lied to by another set, right, then you'll never agree that you have to go solve this problem, because it's too easy to attribute that, you know, those right-wing people are trying to, you know, send misinformation, or this other government is trying to upset our elections. But really takes some sort of global human understanding and agreement. And sadly, it's really hard to get to. I mean, if you look at the last year and you look at, you know, what's happened with COVID, I mean, if that couldn't bring us all together around points of view around misinformation, what would it take? You know, so even though I'm an optimist, I think getting the will to do this at the scale it's necessary, new technology, and new algorithmic things that lower the cost and can show the efficacy of you know, debunking some of these things will lower the cost. And so the threshold of how many people believe it's necessary to actually do that work will go down. So I think eventually we'll get there.
I guess my final question would be, when in the future do you think such AI would be able to be implemented? Like, or what are we looking at about?
Well, actually, I'm optimistic there. I think that the actual techniques for doing the sort of provenance of news and trying to track back, I don't think, I'm not an expert here, but I don't think that there's a huge technological, you know, like algorithmically that we don't know how to do it. So I'm optimistic that it doesn't require huge breakthroughs, modulo what I just said, that, you know, we need to make it cheaper to do so that it's more practical. So I actually think with all of these huge problems, take climate, you know, it's not a problem that you can just set out and solve. What you can do is you can start to solve it in small ways and demonstrate the efficacy of it. So I actually think that there are efforts now that there will start to appear some solutions to this that would be, you know, useful for a motivated person to be able to get her or his, you know, him or her to be able to check the provenance of a point of view and then make an intelligent determination. I believe that's starting to happen now and would be in just a couple of years. To do it at a world scale simultaneously all the time, again, I think it's more of a question of will than technological advances. And I think that predicting when humans will all agree on something, I'm pretty good at predicting when something technically would happen. But I guess the thing is that when it becomes important enough in certain domains, that it will happen quickly. So I would say that, that you'll start to see major advances in this in the next couple of years. And whether it becomes universal and changes public, behavior, you need a fortune teller, not a scientist to tell you that. So again, I am optimistic that I don't think there's huge technological advances that are required to do this. So that makes me optimistic that this will, and that's the other thing to think about. The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. I think what'll happen is you'll get fact checking in specific domains. For example, that kind of, idea migration and stuff is starting to happen, detection is starting to happen in things like intellectual property, where there's high financial stakes, so that you can actually determine whether somebody is impinging on your patent or not impinging, or you can find a space between two other parties' patents and try to make your own patent in there. The same kind of logical extraction of the origin of a thought, the migration of a thought, and the validity of its source is starting to pay off in those economic areas. So I think these kind of problems might actually start appearing in topics like law, where you're looking for precedent or anti-precedent. And so I don't think it'll have to be solved as one giant, unsolvably huge problem. I think you'll start to see it appear in certain disciplines for certain populations. And the more feasible that seems, the lower the barriers, and then the ability to do will, for the will to kick over and have people solve it in specific domains. So I kind of see it as being an evolutionary process, not a revolution where all of a sudden there's one technology to be able to do.
So that kind of concludes, this interview. Thank you so much for agreeing to it.
Yeah, it's such a cool idea that you're doing, Karen. And honestly, I think the fact that people like you, this sounds like old guyism, but the fact that, somebody who's at your age, stage is passionate about this is exactly the kind of evolving will that will make this happen. So I think the fact that you're talking about this and your friends are talking about this is exactly the step that it will take to be this, to become a reality.
Thank you.
Thank you.